Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
More than 19,000 men have appeared in a Major League Baseball game. And when you look back through baseball history, obviously there have been so many great players who have enjoyed long careers. But there were some terrific players who were off to wonderful starts, and they had their careers cut short by injury. And today, we're going to talk about the short career of one of those guys. A guy who won 39 games over a 2-year period, and then, just like that, he was gone. Next, on Sports Forgotten Heroes, the story of Ray Collins.
This is Sports Forgotten Heroes, a tribute to the stars who shaped the games we love to watch and the games we love to play. Stars who provided us with many thrills, but when their time was up, they faded away. We'll take a look back at their spectacular careers, their moments of fame, even if it was just for one season or just one game. And now, here's your host, Warren Rogan.
Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Sports Forgotten Heroes. And once again, thanks for joining me on this ride through the annals of sports as we take a look back at the great but forgotten careers of so many stars whom time has forgotten. And today, we're going to talk about the career of a terrific pitcher, Ray Collins, a guy whom baseball legend Clark Griffith once said of, Ray Collins hasn't a thing, yet he is one of the best pitchers in the American League, one of the 2 or 3 best left-handed pitchers in the game. So what kind of a game did Ray Collins have, and what made him so good? Well, joining us in just a few moments will be Tom Simon, who writes about a very unique group of baseball stars from the past, guys from his home state of Vermont. And Collins is one of the 2 or 3 greatest to ever come out of Vermont. In fact, Collins loved Vermont so much that he spurned the chance to play for several major league teams in order to stay as close as home as possible, which meant he wound up signing with the Boston Red Sox. More on that later. Collins was a dominant college pitcher for the University of Vermont, and at the same time, he dominated in the minor leagues. Yes, you could play in minor league baseball at the same time you were still in college. Of course, the rules have changed since Collins played back in the early 1900s, and we'll get into all of that with Tom in just a moment. First, though, time to take care of a little business. You can follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, TuneIn, Spotify, anywhere you get podcasts. Check out our page on Facebook. Follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on Twitter at SportsFHeroes. Look for Sports Forgotten Heroes on Instagram, or go to the Sports Forgotten Heroes website, sportsfh.com. And that's where you can find more information on the stars we talk about, our guests, links to more articles and video, see who else is on the schedule, and there are also links for you to contact us. Please let us know how we're doing. If you have any suggestions for stars that you'd like to learn more about, or if you just want to leave us a comment, please go to sportsfh.com and let us know. And of course, please leave us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or anywhere else you can rate us. And as always, thanks for your support. Now, back to Ray Collins. He broke into the majors with the Red Sox in 1909 and played for 7 years before a shoulder injury ended his career at the young age of just 28. And as Tom will talk about, leaving the game so early truly had a negative impact on Ray's life. All right. Let's get to our discussion about Ray Collins with Tom Simon now. Tom, welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Warren. I'm glad to be here.
Awesome. I'm really looking forward to this. And right off the bat, who was Ray Collins and what makes his story so interesting?
Ray Collins was a Yankee, and by that I don't mean a New York Yankee because, of course, he pitched for the Red Sox. But he was a descendant. He could trace his roots all the way back to the Mayflower, and his family was among the first settlers of Burlington, Vermont, which is our state's biggest city. So he back in the 1830s, his family purchased a farm just north of Burlington in the town of Colchester. And actually, where I'm sitting here right now as we record this, I'm in Colchester, probably about 2 or 3 miles from the Ray Collins farm.
Oh, cool.
But anyway, his family bought that property in the 1830s. And Ray was born in the 1880s, and he eventually inherited that farm that had been in his family for all those decades. And so he grew up, his family, even though they had the farm in Colchester, they moved around to different farms because the farm in Colchester really wasn't a very good farm. It was wet and it was low. And so for dairy farming, it was not a good place. So they rented property in the Intervale in Burlington, and they had one of the largest farms in Vermont, where they raised Jersey cattle. But something sad happened to Ray when he was only 10 years old. His father died of scarlet fever. So that was kind of like the first sad thing in a string of sad things that happened to Ray Collins throughout his lifetime. But his story is so intertwined with the history of Vermont, right from his ancestors being among the town's first settlers. And then he lived in the Burlington area right up until his death in the 1960s. He served on the University of Vermont. He, of course, attended the University of Vermont, where he was a star athlete in multiple sports. And after his major league career, he returned to Vermont. He lived on the farm. He scraped to make ends meet living on that farm. And because, as I said earlier, it was such a lousy farm for dairy farming that it was a real struggle for him. But he was a pillar in the community. He served on the board of trustees at the University of Vermont. In fact, he was part of the board of trustees when the university actually went from private to public. And he was a leader in the area. And even though he was not always a really happy person, according to his son, who actually died just a few years ago and lived into his 90s, but he was considered, just a real, mover and shaker in the Burlington area, someone that people really respected. So what I find interesting about his story is not only was he a great pitcher, but he was also a great leader, and his whole entire life was spent right in these parts. So
very cool.
He's really, really tied deeply in the community here in the Burlington area.
So I think you probably have an interesting story as well, at least when it comes to writing biographies for the SABR Bio Project. From what I can ascertain, you like to write about guys who have a connection to Vermont. Why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I moved to Vermont in 1993 from Washington, D.C., and one of the first things I did when I got here is I looked in the SABR directory to see if there were any other SABR members in the Burlington area. And I made some phone calls, and we all got together and watched one of the games of the 1993 World Series. I remember it was the Blue Jays and the Phillies. And that was the beginning of what turned out to be the Larry Gardner chapter of the Society for American Baseball Research.
Oh, okay.
And we ended up meeting 3 or 4 times each year. We had a really vibrant, active chapter with, we'd get about 20 people that would show up to the meetings because it's a small state, but per capita, our SABR chapter was right up there with the rest of them. And we had some really interesting people who were a part of our chapter. So as we were having these meetings, we thought, boy, it would be fun, since we are a research society, to do some research. And we decided that we would write a book about all the baseball players who were born in Vermont to make it to the major leagues. So that's how my interest in these guys started. We ended up divvying up the 35 or so players that we were aware of at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And then we put them all together into a book, and we ended up having the book published by New England Press, and the Vermont Historical Society ended up doing a big symposium and exhibit based on the research we'd done. We had tracked down a lot of the descendants of these players who had memorabilia and all kinds of things,
Oh, cool.
that they would pull down from their attic, and they lent that to the exhibition that took place and was up for a year down in the state capitol in Montpelier.
Very neat.
And it was really it was a great group project. It really pulled our group together to work on something as a group, and actually this project was before the SABR Bio Project Committee even existed, and was, I think, part. You'd have to ask Mark Armour the details, but I think it was one of the inspirations for Mark when he decided to try to do a bio committee. In fact, I remember talking to him at the time and saying, you want to write a bio about every major league ball player?
It's crazy.
How are you going to do that? I mean, he had a hard enough time writing about the 35 or so who came from Vermont. You're going to do it on everybody, but my gosh, he's done an amazing job. And they add many every week, and it's really cool to see that project flourish. But I think that we were part of the inspiration for that project.
Wow, that's great. All right, back to Collins. As far as Major League Baseball players are concerned, where does he fit as far as great players from Vermont?
As far as great players from Vermont, he's probably in the top 3 or 4. And of course, it all depends on how you define what is a player from Vermont. Carlton Fisk was born in Vermont, so we included him in our book, but Carlton Fisk doesn't consider himself a Vermonter. In fact, he was so offended when the Red Sox wrote on his Red Sox Hall of Fame plaque that he was a native Vermonter that he insisted that they recast the plaque at a cost of like a couple $1,000 to say that he was actually from New Hampshire, because that's where his home was. It just so happened that the nearest hospital was in Vermont, in Bellows Falls.
Oh, okay.
So if you're talking about where a guy was born, then Carlton Fisk is the greatest. If you talk about kind of where a guy really lived his life and grew up and all that, you'd probably have to say Larry Gardner is the greatest baseball player to come from Vermont. But Ray Collins is right up there, in the top 3 or 4, along with maybe Ray Fisher. Bertie Tebbetts was born in Burlington. But most of our baseball players have come from, before 1920, and actually quite a few of them from the 19th century. In fact, I was just looking at as we record this, the Major League Baseball draft was yesterday.
Yep.
I read an article that listed the top prospect from the player most likely to be drafted first from each of the 50 states. And Vermont was, I should have checked to see where Alaska was, but Vermont was the only state that I saw that apparently they interviewed a bunch of scouts and not a single player from Vermont who was likely to be drafted. So we've kind of fallen off the baseball map here in the 21st century, but there was a time back before 1920 when Vermont, reduced its fair share of major league ball players.
Yeah, playing up in that northeast corridor, the real New England states, I guess, not a whole lot of baseball players come out of there anymore.
No, our season is short. That's for sure. In fact, our high school season, when it starts in April, I mean, we're lucky to get any games in April. It's really May when baseball weather finally comes to Vermont. And so, we're not a hotbed for producing baseball players. That's for sure. We get pretty well in skiing, though.
Is there anybody in the game today from Vermont that you're aware of?
Currently, no. The most recent players who were born in Vermont actually moved out of state when they were like toddlers. One of them is Chris Duffy, who was an outfielder for Pittsburgh and Milwaukee maybe 10 or 15 years ago. He had a pretty short career. He was a kind of an exciting player. He was a center fielder. He was fast, and he was really he was known for his diving catches, but his hitting was not great, and his career was fairly short. And there was there was another guy who played for the A's. So these guys came along after we did our book. Our book came out in 2000. Oh, Derek Barton was his name. Okay. Derek Barton, he was a prospect for the A's, and he got a cup of coffee. But, it's been a while since a Vermonter has done much of anything in the major leagues.
Mm-hmm. You said that Ray Collins does have quite an interesting lineage, we'll say, dating all the way back to, the Pilgrims, and he lists his nationality, like you said, as a Yankee. What about his family's connection to Ethan Allen and the Revolutionary War?
Yeah, so I'd mentioned that his family was among the first settlers of Burlington, and his ancestor, Captain John Collins, built one of the first houses in Burlington. And when Ethan Allen was building his homestead in Burlington, he actually stayed with the Collins family back in the 1780s. So that's how far back Ray Collins could trace his roots in Vermont. And it's pretty much you can't go back in Vermont any further than the 1780s because prior to the 1780s, this was Indian country. It was the Abenakis who were up here, and during the American Revolution, this was controlled by the Indians that were allied with the British. So, you didn't want to be living up in this neck of the woods during the American Revolution. It was a pretty dangerous place.
So you also said that his childhood, it wasn't the greatest. His father passed away when he was quite young. How did his mother care for him? And I guess her name was Electa, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And she turned out to be a pretty smart person, wasn't she?
Yeah. So she was savvy. And her husband had been this dairy farmer, but she wasn't going to be a dairy farmer. So she ended up buying property in Burlington at a time when the city was growing. So she ended up basically becoming a developer. She would buy lots on the outskirts of town and build these houses, which are now really considered in the heart of the town. These beautiful Victorian houses that are kind of in the northern part of the city. And so they lived in one. They grew up in a house at 76 Brooks Avenue, which is walking distance from the University of Vermont campus. Also not too far from Edmonds Middle School now, but it was the Burlington High School back in Ray's day. She made ends meet pretty well by developing property at a time when, it was rare for a woman to be involved in business like that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then she encouraged Ray to play. I mean, he was a pretty darn good athlete. And if I follow the story correctly, he played 3 sports at the University of Vermont, one of which, of course, was baseball. And in his freshman year, he was involved in 2 pretty historic games. Can you tell us a little about them?
Yeah, so I'm sure you're referring. One of the games I'm sure you're referring to is the first game ever to be played at Centennial Field. Mm-hmm. In 1906, our field that we still use here in Burlington for the Vermont Lake Monsters. It's their home field, even though the University of Vermont disbanded its baseball program in 2009. Much to my dismay. But that beautiful old ballpark dates all the way back to 1906, and the first pitch ever thrown at that field was thrown by Ray Collins, who started UVM's first varsity baseball game as a freshman and, pitched the team to a victory. He also had a couple of hits. And not only was Ray Collins the first player to ever throw a pitch at Centennial Field, but the first batter for Vermont was Larry Gardner, who batted leadoff as a freshman. It's interesting that Gardner and Collins were classmates at the University of Vermont. You know, they both entered in 1906. Pretty incredible that two of the greatest baseball players ever to come from Vermont both, you know, grew up at the exact same time and were the same year and, you know, played for the UVM team. It's you know, if I could go back in time, I sure would love to see that team in action. And then I think you're probably referring. So he pitched he was their main pitcher during his freshman year, and he took a no-hitter into the ninth inning, right? I think he took a perfect game into the ninth inning, and then with 2 outs, he ended up giving up a base hit, but the guy ended up getting thrown out stealing, and his classmates carried him off the field on his shoulders as they achieved a 1-0 victory over Williams College, which at the time was one of the greatest powerhouses in baseball. It's kind of fun when you do research about college baseball in this area, because nowadays, you know, all of the college baseball powerhouses are from you know, the SEC or the Pac-10, you know, California, Texas, Florida, places like that. But back in Ray Collins' day, the powerhouse baseball teams were New England schools like Williams College and you know, Harvard and all the Ivy League schools, and of course UVM, University of Vermont, was right up there with the best of them, and produced a number of major league players in that era, including not only Larry Gardner and Ray Collins, but Ed Rulbach, who was I bet you're probably going to do a feature on him someday, because he's another kind of unsung great pitcher from that era, you know, kind of borderline Hall of Fame candidate. And he pitched for the University of Vermont and also for Notre Dame. He kind of transferred around quite a bit, and went directly from the UVM campus to the major leagues, just as Larry Gardner and Ray Collins did too. These guys didn't serve minor league apprentices. They went straight to the MLB team right from the campus. So yeah, it was a different era back then.
Absolutely. And when he was pitching for Vermont, teams in the major leagues were getting wind of just how good Ray Collins was. And I'm really referring to two in particular, the Boston Red Sox and the New York Highlanders, who, of course, are now known as the New York Yankees. So those two teams really, I mean, they've had this rivalry forever. And they both showed a lot of interest in Ray Collins. But he decided not to join either team and stick in college. Why was that?
So Ray Collins, he bled green and gold. That's the University of Vermont's school colors, and I've read descriptions of what his house looked like. You know, he had a kind of like a trophy room right in the front parlor of his Victorian home on Brooks Avenue, and it was just loaded with, you know, all kinds of green and gold, you know, banners and pennants and, you know, trophies and all that stuff from his athletic career, and so he just loved the University of Vermont. He always said throughout his life that the 4 greatest years of his life were the years he spent at UVM, not his major league years, but his years in college were really his high point. He was a good student. He was like a true scholar athlete, and he was popular on campus, had a lot of friends, was involved in all the, you know, activities. He and Larry Gardner were both members of the Boulder Society, which is like a secret society of all the big men on campus. So, you know, that was he loved UVM. He grew up literally a stone's throw from the campus. And so, you know, when all these major league teams were coming to him, and by the time he was a senior, he had offers from, there were only 16 teams in the league at the time, and he had offers from 8 of them. So half of them wanted him, but he shunned them all until he graduated, because he didn't want to give up a minute of his college experience. He just loved the University of Vermont. Now contrast that to Larry Gardner, who left after his sophomore year to go directly to the Boston Red Sox, and Ray Collins Jr., who was the Ray Collins we're talking about son, who died just a few years ago at the age of like 95, told me that he thought, you know, for Collins and Gardner, you know, they were so tied throughout their lives together, and yet they were not close friends. And Ray Collins Jr. always speculated that his father held a grudge against Larry Gardner for signing with the Red Sox after his sophomore year, because he thinks that, actually, I'm sorry, it was after his junior year.
Mm-hmm.
He thinks that if his father thought that if Larry had stayed on for his senior year, they would have been, one of the greatest college baseball teams of all time. And certainly Ray had all the same opportunities that Larry did to go pro. In fact, he probably had more opportunities being a pitcher. But he stayed at Vermont, and there's speculation that he always harbored a bit of a grudge against Larry Gardner for going pro instead of staying at his alma mater.
Huh, interesting. The structure of college baseball and professional baseball obviously was quite different back then than it is today. And Collins, and I'm not sure if it was all of his college teammates, but definitely some of his college teammates, actually played professional baseball, albeit Class D ball, in 1907, and I think a couple other places as well, while they were still in college. How did that work?
Yeah, so, there was no NCAA at the time, and there were not really any kind of uniform rules that applied to professionalism and amateur athletes, and, that was starting to develop. Certainly there were players in that era who would play during the summer. They would play professional baseball under an alias so they wouldn't get discovered by a rival college and get ratted out and lose their eligibility. But ultimately, there was no NCAA that would punish them. It was up to their own college to decide whether they were eligible or not.
Huh.
And so, if you had there were actually, I don't think any of these colleges had athletic directors at the time. If there was a question about eligibility, it came down to the faculty. Some of the colleges had faculty advisors to the athletic program. But ultimately, if there was a question about whether a guy was eligible or not, it was probably up to the faculty to decide. And every college had its different rules. So in this kind of gray area, the whole entire University of Vermont baseball team spent a summer playing professional baseball.
Were they paid?
Yeah.
Wow.
They were paid. And, that was that, even then, that might have been looked on as, kind of borderline, maybe they shouldn't be doing that. But they got away with it. And things like that were going on quite a bit. This was the transition era. Probably 5-10 years later, that you wouldn't have been able to do something like that. But this was just at the beginning of cracking down on the line between amateurs and professionals. And so the UVM baseball team walked that line, and probably felt, well, they fell on the professional side of it. But they still managed to continue to play college baseball the following season.
And so, like I said, he also played in a few other places. I guess a couple of the guys might have played in a few other places that summer as well. And we're talking the summer of 1907. And once he was done with the college team, he ended up in Maine. Playing for Bangor, Maine, playing for a minor league team up there. And they liked him so much, they actually offered him decent money to come back in the summer of 1908. Tell us about the team that he played for in Maine and just how good he was and what he meant to them.
Well, contemporary accounts say he was the best player in that league. And that was, professional league. So Ray Collins, he was the keys to his success as a pitcher. He was a big guy for his time. He was 6'1", 185, which, nowadays that wouldn't be considered particularly big for a pitcher. But back in his era, that was big. Mm-hmm. But despite being a big guy, he was not a hard thrower. The keys to his success were, number one, his remarkable control. Number two, the fact that he was left-handed. And number three, he had this really herky-jerky, unusual delivery that threw a lot of batters off. And so you combine an unusual delivery with pinpoint control, left-handedness, and the ability to throw a variety of pitches, and you've got a pretty dominant pitcher, especially for playing against college level players. So he was mowing them down in New England, and that's how he ended up getting scouted by so many different teams. He was one of the best college players of his day.
And after all of those journeys to Maine or playing with his college team in the summer, he finally comes back to Vermont in 1909 to put a bow on his college career, and it was one heck of a bow. Talk about his overall career at Vermont and that very special last game he played.
So he's got records that at University of Vermont that will never be broken, especially since we no longer have a baseball team. During the course of his 4 years, they would only play 15 or 17 games in a season back then, and he won 37 games over the course of his 4-year career. So that's a lot of victories. That's almost 10 per season when your team is only playing a 15 or 16 game schedule. So he was a phenomenal college pitcher, and during his senior year, now Larry Gardner's already playing for the Boston Red Sox at this point, but they still had a pretty good team, still considered one of the best in New England. And in his very last game, he went up against a team from Penn State and pitched a no-hitter to cap off his college career. And then he went from that game, he ended up signing with the Red Sox, going down to Boston to sign his contract. But he had worked it out with the Red Sox that he would be allowed to come back to Burlington to go through graduation with his class of 1909 at the University of Vermont. And he did that. He came back to Burlington. He ended up giving one of the speeches during the graduation ceremony. And 1909 happened to be the 300th anniversary of Samuel D. Champlain's discovery of Lake Champlain. So there was a great big celebration going on for that. And in fact, just a few years ago for the 400th anniversary, they had another big, I was able to go to that. So I know kind of what a big deal it was here in Burlington, but it was an even bigger deal back in 1909 for the 300th, because not only did they have a pageant in Burlington Harbor, we're right here on Lake Champlain, and they built a man-made island in Burlington Harbor where they reenacted Samuel D. Champlain's founding or discovery of the lake, and he ended up having an altercation with the natives, and they reenacted that on this man-made island in Burlington Harbor, which I wish I could go back and see that. That must have been something. But then part of the celebration, they had a baseball game, and Ray Collins pitched for a local team against a professional team that came up from Massachusetts, and he pitched a shutout for 9 innings, and then he moved to the outfield and ended up knocking in the winning run in the 13th for a 1-0 victory.
Wow.
So that was his last game here in Vermont before he went directly from Burlington to join the Red Sox on a road trip. And just a week later, he made his major league debut in a game against the Cleveland Indians. It was quite the game. I mean, tell us about that game. I mean, he did pretty well at the plate. He did pretty well on the mound, and something happened for the first time ever in a Major League Baseball game. He got a base hit in his first at bat, his first plate appearance. And this is the game that's best remembered because Neil Ball turned the first unassisted triple play in Major League history. So
Ray's always in the right place at the right time. He's got a lot of history behind him.
Yeah, his opponent on the mound for Cleveland that day was Cy Young. Pretty interesting guy to be going up against in your first game ever. And what I think is interesting about this particular game is it's probably the only game in Major League history in which 3 Vermont-born players all played for the same team. Larry Gardner, Ray Collins, and a guy named Amby McConnell played second base for the Red Sox that day. Amby McConnell was born in Pownell, Vermont. And so there were 3 players born in Vermont in the lineup for the Red Sox, all in that one game, which at this point is looking like it will never happen again.
Hey, of all the teams that wanted to sign Ray Collins, why did he pick Boston? Was it strictly because of where Boston was located?
I gotta think geography played a big part in that. That's Larry Gardner went to the Red Sox also, and we have back in those days great rail connection to Boston, or certainly better than to almost any other place in the major leagues. So it was just a local team. Mm-hmm. It was the team that followed him, that people up here followed most closely, and to this day, and I think it was just kind of natural for him to go there, and it allowed him to get home, more easily than he would if he had played somewhere else. And in fact, in 1910. He joined the Red Sox in 1909, but in 1910, which was his second year with the team, after the season ended, he came back and brought the entire Red Sox to Centennial Field in Burlington to play an exhibition game, an inter-squad exhibition game. Mm-hmm. So it was actually, one team was led by Ray Collins, the other team was led by Larry Gardner, and they split up their teammates. Tris Speaker and all those guys, played up here in Burlington, and in October after the Major League season had just ended, and it must have been a spectacular day for Vermont baseball fans to have a Major League team come and play up here.
Sure. So his first 2 years with the Red Sox, 1909, he goes 4-3, and he followed that with a 13-11 campaign in 1910. First, tell us just how well he pitched for the Red Sox after he joined him midway through the 1909 season, and what his opponents were thinking of him.
So I had said earlier that probably one of the most important things to Ray Collins' success as a pitcher was his remarkable control. And throughout his career in the major leagues, he ranked in the top 5 pitchers in walks per 9 innings. He was always walking fewer than 2 batters per game, and that was a huge part of his success. And for in that 1912, 1913, 1914 era, he was considered one of the top pitchers in the American League, and either he or Eddie Plank would have been considered the premier left-handed pitcher in the league. Mm-hmm. Clark Griffith said he was the best pitcher in the league, and that was when Griffith was managing the New York Islanders. Yeah. And Ty Cobb always said that he was Ray Collins was one of the toughest pitchers he ever faced. So he was a very well respected pitcher during his peak years, but his peak was fairly short lived. He had an arm injury. I think it was in 1915 or 16. He ended up injured his shoulder.
Before we get there, though, let's go back. Let's go back a little bit. Like you did say, Clark Griffith, who was a manager at the time, he said of Collins, and you wrote this, Ray Collins hasn't a thing, yet he is one of the best pitchers in the American League. On the 2 or 3, or one of the 2 or 3 best left-handed pitchers in the game. So you referred to this a couple of times. What made him so good?
His control, his unusual windup, his left-handedness, and his ability to throw a number of different kinds of breaking off-speed pitches.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
He was a finesse pitcher. He was not overpowering. That was not his game, but he could put it exactly where he wanted it. Kind of reminds me of a a current resident of Vermont, Bill Lee, another left-handed pitcher who, they would say he hasn't a thing. He could never throw hard, but he could throw any pitch in any count, and he was a competitor like Ray Collins. I think they were similar pitchers.
Mm-hmm. The Spaceman.
The Spaceman.
Yep. Yeah. So again, he went 13-11 in 1910, and then as the story goes, he fell in love, and some think that actually affected his career, especially in 1911. Can you expand on that period and how Ray was able to turn things around?
Well, so in 1911, the Red Sox went out to Redondo Beach, California for spring training. And one of Ray's fraternity brothers was a guy named Jack Lovely, who had grown up in St. Albans, Vermont, but his family had moved to the Los Angeles area right around the time that Ray and Jack were in college together. So when Jack found out that Ray was going out to California for spring training, he said, "You got to look up my family while you're out there." And it turns out that Jack Lovely had a sister named Lillian who fit the family's name. Ray went out there and met the Lovely family and became smitten with Lillian, and they started a relationship. And some speculate that he was focused more on his love life than on his pitching at the beginning of the 1911 season. But eventually he turned it around and turned in a pretty solid campaign. There was a time at the beginning of 1911 where he got off to a lousy start. Mm-hmm. There was some speculation that he might actually get released.
So that 1911 season, Ray did get off to a bad start, going 3-6. But he turned it around and went 8-6 to finish the year at 11-12, with a more than respectable 2.40 ERA and 14 complete games. During that offseason, Ray and Lillian married, and the story goes that Ray did not report to spring training in great shape. In fact, he was noticeably overweight. Nonetheless, he went about his business and wound up taking a spike to his knee. The spike, which resulted in an abscess along with a weight issue, were too much to overcome, and Ray did not start the 1912 season with the Red Sox. In fact, he missed the first 2 months of the season. He finally joined the Red Sox in June and helped lead them to a World Series win over the New York Giants. For the year, Ray was 13-8 with a 2.53 ERA. He had 17 complete games and 4 shutouts. Okay, sidebar. The series was a best of 7, but Game 2 ended in a 6-6 tie after 11 innings. So the Red Sox actually won the World Series 4-3 plus a tie. While Ray didn't figure in any of the decisions, he did appear in 2 games, starting one and relieving in the other, for a total of 14 1/3 innings, in which he gave up just 3 earned runs. Smokey Joe Wood, he won 3 games for the Red Sox, and Hugh Benedict won the other. So 1913, Ray Collins goes 19-8. And then 1914 comes about, and that was a very turbulent year for baseball. The Federal League was organizing, and many players in the game were using the Federal League to their advantage, including Ray Collins. First,
yes,
if you can tell us a little bit about the Federal League, where did it come from, and just how did it plan for success?
All right, so the Federal League was a challenger to the American and National Leagues, just like the American League had been a challenger to the National League only 15 years earlier. So what the Federal League owners did is they invaded mostly minor league towns, places like Buffalo and Newark, New Jersey, and Baltimore, but also went head to head in places like Chicago, where the Chicago Whales started off in what we now know as Wrigley Field. That ballpark was built for the Chicago Whales of the Federal League, and in Brooklyn they had a team called the Tip Tops that battled against the Brooklyn Robins, as they were then known, or the Dodgers. Some people call them the Dodgers, but so it was a rival league to the major leagues, and I think the hope amongst the Federal League owners is similar to the hope of the people who started the American League and the people who started the American Basketball Association many decades later, and the people who started the USFL in football many decades later. They hope that they can cause enough hardship to the existing established leagues that eventually they'll merge. And I think that was always the kind of the hope from the Federal League owners, that they would be able to exist long enough that eventually they would be able to become part of organized baseball. But through a series of lawsuits that Judge Landis sat on, that never ruled on, they basically eventually ran out of money, and the story is that Landis ended up getting his job as commissioner, kind of as a reward for sitting on the lawsuit so long, that where the Federal League sought to challenge the established major leagues under the Sherman Antitrust Act. So, but Ray Collins had the good fortune to be at his peak at a time when the Federal League and the established leagues were competing over players. Players were jumping contracts. They were getting 2 and 3 times more than they had earned, just a couple of years earlier before the Federal League came into existence. And Ray Collins was very active in the Baseball Players Fraternity, which is kind of a predecessor of the Major League Players Union. And so he was looking to make money for himself, and also to set a standard for his fellow players, because he was a leader in that movement. So he ended up doing quite well in his contract negotiations by leveraging the Federal League.
Ray did leverage the Federal League to his benefit. The Red Sox offered Ray a contract for $4,500 for the 1914 season. Ray felt that wasn't enough, and he wanted $5,000. Right around the same time that the Red Sox offered Ray the $5,000, the Federal League came calling and offered Ray a 3-year deal at $5,000 a year, but with a $7,500 signing bonus. So Ray spurned the Red Sox, sent a letter back saying that he now wanted $5,400. Management was not happy. Management said they thought they had an agreement. Ray thought about it, and he agreed to the $5,000 and reported to spring training, only to find that several of his teammates claimed their contracts weren't good and they were going to jump to the Federal League. Ray didn't know what to do. The Federal League wanted Ray bad. Ray sought the advice of family, and in the end, when Boston placed a deadline on Ray to sign with the team, he ultimately agreed to a 2-year deal, partly because he was fearful of just how solid the Federal League was. Well, of course, the Federal League made it just 2 years. Indianapolis won in 1914, and Chicago won in 1915. As for Ray Collins, he went on to enjoy the best year of his career. That 1914 season, I would say, Ray more than satisfied his contract. He went 20-13, and the team's top pitcher, Smokey Joe Wood, was ill, and they needed someone to fill in his shoes, or to fill his shoes in, and Ray did. So he had a very strong 1914 season, and it's crazy to think, here's Ray Collins on top of the world. 1913, he goes 19-8. 1914, he goes 20-13. He basically establishes himself as the team's number 1 pitcher. He has a 2.51 ERA. So over the course of 2 years, he wins 39 games. Along comes 1915, and he's relegated to the bullpen. What happened?
He had a shoulder injury, and it never was diagnosed. But he just couldn't pitch the way he had before, and it was just what has happened to so many players in Major League history. You know, they get off to a good start, and then an injury causes their career to be a lot shorter than it would have been. And Ray Collins is a classic example. We'll never know what he would have gone on to become if he had just stayed healthy. But he was certainly on a good trajectory when, unfortunately, he had this problem with his shoulder. What's interesting?
Yeah, go ahead.
What's interesting about that shoulder injury is that he finally just gives up. He gives up trying. He just can't do it. He comes back to the farm here in Vermont, and around 1922 or so, after he's been out of baseball for 6 years, he continues to pitch here and there for kind of local teams. When barnstorming teams would come to play at Centennial Field in Burlington, he would pitch for the locals, and his shoulder came back. Not through any kind of surgery or anything like that, but he just somehow it came back to him. His ability to pitch returned, and it even crossed his mind to try to make a comeback, but he never did. And so, there's stories about, like, in 1922, a traveling black baseball team for Brooklyn came up to Centennial. It was a high-powered team, and out comes Ray Collins to pitch for the local team, and just shuts down this barnstorming black team. And afterwards, the players are like, "Who are you? Who are you? Why did you learn to pitch like that? Why are you pitching here?" He was this former Major League standout, and who had lost his ability to pitch because of an injury, but then miraculously it came back 6 years later.
But he was too old to go back, or he just didn't want to, or what happened there?
He was established. He was married. They were living on the farm. He couldn't really leave his dairy cattle, and he just had a life here at that point. So he ended up staying in Vermont. And I think that he probably regretted that decision because his life in Vermont was a struggle. As a dairy farmer, he had some really terrible luck. He had taken the money he had saved from his baseball career to invest in a state-of-the-art milking parlor, and before he could get a chance to buy insurance on it, it burned down. So he lost basically everything he had saved from baseball, and as I said before, that farm that had been in his family since the 1830s is kind of a ledgy farm. It's really rocky. It's wet. It's not an easy place to be a dairy farmer. And so he struggled. He struggled on his own on that farm, just trying to make ends meet. And as the years went on, his family would take in boarders. That kind of like a predecessor to today's bed and breakfasts. He would take in people who were tourists in Vermont. They would come and stay with him on his farm, and he had a sugaring operation. He'd make maple syrup by chopping all the trees on his property, and that was an important part of his livelihood, making maple syrup. So he was just kind of the quintessential Vermonter. He was just kind of doing a bunch of different things to try to scrape together a living, and but throughout those years, he was always considered a great leader in our community. He coached the University of Vermont baseball team, but again, it took too much time away from the farm for him, so he ended up giving up the gig. And it turns out that Larry Gardner ends up getting that job after Ray Collins gives it up. And, Gardner remains the baseball coach for decades, and then eventually becomes the athletic director at UVM and lives a very, comfortable existence, in sports, dealing with college players. He really enjoyed his post-baseball career, whereas poor Ray, was on that farm by himself, trying to, milk all those cows and raise all those crops, and, on the tractor, late into the evening. His son told me, he'd be out there with a light on his tractor, at midnight, trying to just raise his crops.
Was it a sad life?
Yeah, I mean, Ray Jr., when he talks about his dad, he says his dad was kind of a bitter guy, which is, and you can almost see it when you look at photographs of Ray Collins from throughout his life. He's never really smiling, whereas Larry Gardner, big smile on his face, happy-go-lucky, kind of a sprightly guy. Ray Collins, kind of a big, dour, was kind of like a sourpuss,
Mm-hmm.
and then as he got older, he had health problems. In 1962, they had a 50th anniversary of the Boston Red Sox World Champion team from 1912 at Fenway Park. And Ray Collins, he walked with a cane. He was actually, sometimes in a wheelchair, and he would go out. He was going to fly down to Boston for that. He really wanted to be a part of that 50th anniversary celebration.
Uh-huh.
So he and his family would go out to the airport. And he would practice boarding the airplane.
Wow.
Yeah, he would go out there several times to just practice getting up and down those stairs, so he could make sure he could get on to the airplane on the big day when it was time to go down to Fenway Park for the 50th anniversary. And so life was kind of a struggle for him, but nobody from the outside would have known that, because, again, he was the big man on campus at UVM. He'd gone on to the major leagues. He came back here. Everybody knew him. Everyone, respected him. He was constantly getting jury duty for some reason, but every time he would be on a jury, they would name him the foreman. During World War II, he served on the local draft board, and was very instrumental in supporting our troops overseas by having all the farmers continue to raise their crops and donating food to the soldiers, and serving here in Colchester on the town council, and being involved in politics. Of course, everybody up here in those days was Republican. Nowadays, everyone's Democrat or an independent or a Bernie Sanders supporter, progressive. Very few Republicans left. But back in, prior to 1960, Vermont was a Republican bastion. And so, Ray Collins, he was a pretty conservative guy. And so he was a leader in the community and well respected, but not really a happy guy, because he was struggling. It was struggling. It was uncomfortable for him. He never could ease up, and farming is a hard way to make a living.
Sure.
And if you've got, injuries from your playing days, and, as you age, it gets harder and harder. And he had no choice. He had to keep on doing it. His son did not come back to the farm. His son went on to medical school. Good for him.
Yeah,
I think Ray probably would have said, "You did the right thing, kid. Stick with it."
Yep.
But poor Ray was left, to try to make a living on his own, and it was a struggle.
The name of this podcast is Sports Forgotten Heroes, and we take a look back at guys from all the different games whom time has forgotten, and they might have been famous for one game. They might have had just one great hit, a great season, and sometimes, obviously, a great career. In the end, how do we quantify the career of Ray Collins?
I would say that it is a career that was cut short. And so we'll never quite know what he would have become if he had just stayed healthy. But certainly during, the 4 or 5 years that he was able to pitch in the major leagues, he was one of the best. And if he had continued on for another 10 or more years, everybody would remember his name, because of course the Red Sox of that era had some powerhouse teams. And, he would have been fortunate to play on all of those teams until they sold off all their players to the Yankees, and that's a different story. But he was in the right place at the right time. If he only could have stayed healthy, and I think that he would have been, his name would be a lot better known now if he had just managed to stay healthy.
Well, Tom, thank you so much for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes, and I sure do hope you would consider coming back again. Maybe we could talk about Larry or even Bertie Tebbetts.
Sure. Happy to do it anytime.
Awesome. Well, again, thanks so much. A lot about Ray Collins. I love your enthusiasm for your now home state of Vermont, and it was a real treat having you on the show.
Thanks. It was my pleasure.
So Ray Collins played 7 years in the majors, all with the Red Sox. His best season came in 1914 when he went 20-13 with a 2.51 ERA, 16 complete games, and 6 shutouts. For his career, he was 84-62 with a career ERA of 2.51 as well. There's no telling how good he could have been, but his career was certainly going in the right trajectory before it was cut short by the shoulder injury. But when you look back at his entire body of work, including his time at the University of Vermont and the few years he played minor league ball while he was still in college, I think it's pretty fair to say that Ray Collins certainly enjoyed a wonderful baseball career. Thank you again to Tom Simon. You can read more of Tom's work at SABR.org. That's SABR.org. Next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes, we're going to explore the career of a terrific power hitter for the Cleveland Indians, a guy who was overshadowed by greats like Lou Gehrig and Jimmy Fox. We're talking about Hal Trosky, who had a very powerful swing. That's next time. For now, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.